Welcome, dear students, to today's class on adrenocorticotropic hormone. We were talking about pituitary hormones, and we've already discussed a few hormones in the released or synthesized from the pituitary gland. And today we'll be talking about adrenocorticotropic hormone. Short, in short, it's called as ACTH. So the ACTH is a polypeptide tropic hormone. So tropic hormone is also known as a releasing hormone. So that tropic hormones activate or induce another organ system to release a particular hormone, right? So the ACTH is a polypeptide tropic hormone with 39 amino acids, and it is produced and secreted by corticotropes in the anterior pituitary. Uh, the ACTH is synthesized as a pre-pro-opiomelanocortin, which is a further processed post-translational processing to form the active ACTH hormone. So the half-life is 10 minutes, and ACTH can further be degraded to melanocyte stimulating hormone and CLIP protein. So in this figure, these are the different functions of ACTH. So ACTH induces enhanced glucocorticoid release, directs central nervous system actions, indirect central nervous system actions like, for example, nitric oxide, inhibition of corticotropin releasing hormone release from the hypothalamus, increased neurosteroid synthesis, enhanced deoxycorticosterone release. So these are the different functions of the ACTH. So the hypothalamus releases CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, which acts on the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary releases ACTH. So ACTH activates the adrenal cortex to release cortisol, so that blood concentrations of cortisol increases. Okay, so when there is a low blood levels of cortisol, it produces a feedback towards the hypothalamus. So it's not a feedback inhibition, it's a feedback activation. So the hypothalamus secretes more CRH. CRH secretes or CRH triggers the pituitary to secrete ACTH. ACTH triggers the adrenal cortex to secrete cortisol, and the blood levels will increase. So consider your blood levels have increased, and this will produce a feedback inhibition of the hypothalamus. As a result, the hypothalamus stops producing CRH, pituitary stops secretion of ACTH, and the adrenal cortex is not triggered to release cortisol. And as a result, the cortisol concentrations in blood will decrease. Okay. So in this figure, you can see that CRH, which is released by the hypothalamus, binds to the receptor on corticotropes in the pituitary, which is a G protein coupled receptor which activates the PKA pathway. So the G protein will activate adenyl cyclase. Adenyl cyclase converts ATP to cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP activates protein kinase A, and protein kinase A phosphorylates several proteins. As a result, it affects the transcription in the nucleus of the mRNA to synthesize ACTH. So that is the POMC, pro-opiomelanocortin mRNA, and which is secreted to the, so which enters the rough endoplasmic reticulum, undergoes processing, post-translational processing. So the pre-pro hormone becomes pro hormone, And from the rough endoplasmic reticulum it goes to the Golgi, where again the part is removed and it becomes the active pro-opiomelanocortin hormone, which is then secreted into secretory granules or vesicles, and in the secretory vesicles the POMC is degraded to form active ACTH as well as beta lipo and as well as beta LPH hormone. So in this figure you can again see it's a receptor, ACTH receptor is there. The ACTH goes and binds to the ACTH receptor, which is again a G protein coupled receptor, but it has both the PKC pathway and the PKA pathway. So the PKA pathway, unlike cyclase, converts ATP to cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP activates protein kinase A, which causes several protein phosphorylations. And the protein phosphorylation, as a result, esterase is activated so that cholesterol ester is degraded to cholesterol. Cholesterol is then transported into the mitochondria, and inside the mitochondria, cholesterol undergoes degradation to form pregnenolone, and the pregnenolone is released from the mitochondria, and in the cytosol pregnenolone is finally converted to cortisol, and the cortisol is released for circulation. The second pathway is through the phospholipase C, which converts phosphatidylinositol diphosphate into inositol triphosphate and diacylglycerol. Diacylglycerol activates protein kinase C, which again causes protein phosphorylation, which again helps in this whole process. Whereas inositol triphosphate activates the intracellular reserve of calcium from the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, which causes the release of calcium into the cell. As a result, the calcium calmodulin dependent kinase is activated, which again causes protein phosphorylation, which affects the same pathway. So there are three different enzymes that are involved here. You have the calcium cam dependent kinase, protein kinase A, and protein kinase C. So in this you can see that the hypothalamus, which releases CRH, activates the pituitary to release the ACTH, and the ACTH has a major effect on the adrenal cortex, so that the adrenal cortex releases cortisol, and it has a minor effect as a result of which the adrenal cortex secretes aldosterone. So the adrenal cortex or the cortisol and the aldosterone is important for two factors. The cortisol increases blood glucose concentration, increases protein metabolism, and it is anti-inflammatory in system. Aldosterone affects the kidney tubules to excrete potassium, reabsorb sodium, conserve water, and reduce the urine volume. Reduce urine and increase the blood volume. Okay. So this is a function of the ACTH. The black dots, that's a function of the ACTH. Increases potassium concentration, decreases sodium concentration, decreases blood pressure or volume. So this is the regulation or the feedback regulation of the whole system. So based on the stress conditions, the hypothalamus will initially release CRH, which activates pituitary gland releases ACTH, which activates adrenal cortex releases cortisol. The cortisol produces a feedback inhibition of the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, whereas the target cells may produce a feedback inhibition as a result which can modify the stress levels. So in this you can see that we'll start with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus Corticotropin releasing hormone activates pituitary. Corticotropin is released. Corticotropin is another name for ACTH, and ACTH activates adrenal cortex. Cortisol is released. Cortisol inhibits pituitary. Cortisol also inhibits hypothalamus. Cortisol also inhibits macrophages, which has an effect on interleukin 1 and which activates the hypothalamus. So this is for the inflammatory conditions. Interleukin 1 is considered to be a pro-inflammatory cytokine which is released before the inflammation process has started. So it actually increases the inflammation. Cortisol produces a positive effect on the liver, as a result of which the blood glucose concentration is also affected or increased, and the blood glucose produces a negative effect on the hypothalamus. So that was about ACTH.